Picture this: a warm summer evening in 1973. The kind of evening where the sun hangs low and golden, where children play in yards until their mothers call them inside, where the world feels safe and whole. Now picture a young man walking down a quiet street in Ohio, his whole life stretching out before him like an endless highway of possibility. He has dreams. He has people who love him. He has tomorrow. Except tomorrow never came for Norman Prater. I need you to understand something before we go any further. This is not just another cold case story. This is not just another documentary about a forgotten victim. This is the story of how 52 years of silence were finally shattered. This is the story of how the dead can still speak, if only we're willing to listen. And this is the story of how one family refused to let the world forget. If you've ever wondered whether justice has an expiration date, stay with me. If you've ever thought that some secrets are buried too deep to ever surface, I'm about to prove you wrong. And if you believe that love can outlast death, that persistence can outmatch evil, that truth always finds a way, then this story was made for you. Before we continue, I need to ask you something. There are families right now, tonight, who are still waiting for answers about their loved ones. People who check their phones every morning hoping for news that never comes. If this story moves you, if it makes you think of someone who might need to hear it, share it. Subscribe to this channel. Because stories like Norman Prater's deserve to be told, and they deserve to be heard by everyone who believes that no victim should ever be forgotten. Do it now, before you forget. The share button is right there. Now, let me take you back. Back to a time before cell phones and DNA databases. Back to a time when a person could disappear and the earth itself seemed to swallow them whole. Norman Prater was 23 years old in the summer of 1973. He was a young black man living in a country that was still wrestling with the demons of its past. The Civil Rights Act was less than a decade old. The wounds of segregation were still fresh and bleeding. And in countless communities across America, the disappearance of a young black man didn't always make the front page. Norman was known in his community as someone who lit up a room. He had that kind of laugh that made other people laugh, even if they didn't know what was funny. He had dreams of building something, of making his mark on the world. His family described him as the kind of person who would give you the shirt off his back, even if it was his last one. He had a girlfriend who loved him. He had a mother who prayed for him every night. He had siblings who looked up to him. He had a future. And then, one day, he was simply gone. The circumstances of his disappearance were murky from the start. Some said he had been seen with people he shouldn't have been seen with. Others said he had gotten mixed up in something, though no one could say exactly what. There were whispers and rumors, the kind that spread through small communities like wildfire, burning everything they touch but illuminating nothing. His family reported him missing immediately. They went to the police. They knocked on doors. They asked questions that no one seemed willing to answer. And at every turn, they were met with indifference, with dismissal, with the unspoken suggestion that maybe Norman had simply chosen to leave. But his mother knew. Mothers always know. She knew that her son would never have left without a word. She knew that something terrible had happened. And she knew that no one with the power to help seemed to care. The investigation, such as it was, went nowhere. There were no leads. There were no witnesses willing to come forward. There was only silence, thick and suffocating, like a blanket thrown over the truth. Days turned into weeks. Weeks turned into months. And slowly, inevitably, the world moved on. New cases came in. New priorities emerged. Norman Prater's file was pushed further and further back until it gathered dust on a shelf somewhere, forgotten by everyone except the people who loved him. But love doesn't forget. Love doesn't move on. Love waits. And for 52 years, Norman Prater's family waited. They waited through seasons and decades. They waited through births and deaths and everything in between. They waited as the world changed around them, as technology advanced, as new tools emerged that could shine light into the darkest corners. They waited because they had to. They waited because giving up would have meant accepting that Norman's life didn't matter. And that was something they could never do. I want you to hold on to that feeling as we move forward. Hold on to the image of a family sitting by a phone that never rings, of a mother growing old with questions that have no answers, of siblings gathering on birthdays and holidays with an empty chair at the table. Because what happened next, decades later, would prove that their faith was not misplaced. What happened next would remind the world that cold cases can become warm again. And what happened next would finally give Norman Prater something he had been denied for half a century. A voice. Let me tell you what 52 years of waiting looks like. Let me paint you a picture of the kind of purgatory that families of the missing are forced to endure, because unless you've lived it, you cannot truly understand it. Imagine waking up every single morning with a weight on your chest. Before your eyes even open, before your feet touch the floor, you remember. You remember that someone you love is gone. You remember that you don't know what happened to them. You remember that somewhere out there, someone might know the truth, and they're not talking. This was the reality for Norman Prater's family for more than 5 decades. His mother, God rest her soul, never stopped believing that the truth would come out. Even as her hair turned gray, even as her joints grew stiff and her eyes grew dim, she held on to hope like it was a lifeline. Every time the phone rang, her heart would skip. Every time there was a knock at the door, she would hold her breath. And every time, it was nothing. A telemarketer, a neighbor, someone who didn't have the answers she desperately needed. She attended church every Sunday, and she prayed for her son. She prayed for his soul, wherever it might be. She prayed for the person who had taken him, that they might find it in their heart to confess. And she prayed for strength, because some days, the not knowing was almost too much to bear. Norman's siblings grew up in the shadow of his absence. They went to school and got jobs and started families of their own, but there was always something missing. At every graduation, every wedding, every birth, there was a void where Norman should have been. They learned to live with it, the way you learn to live with a chronic pain. You adapt, you adjust, but it never stops hurting. And the community? The community moved on, as communities always do. New families moved into the neighborhood. New stories filled the local newspaper. The world kept spinning, indifferent to the grief of one family, to the mystery of one missing man. But there were those who remembered. Elderly neighbors who would see Norman's siblings and shake their heads sadly. Old friends who would mention him in hushed tones, always in the past tense. People who knew that something terrible had happened that summer in 1973, even if they couldn't prove it. The police file remained closed. Or rather, it remained open in the technical sense, one of thousands of unsolved cases gathering dust in storage rooms across the country. Every few years, a new detective might pull it out, flip through the yellowed pages, and shake their head. No new leads, no new witnesses, no new hope. The thing about cold cases is that they're not really cold. They're frozen. Everything about them is preserved in amber, locked in place at the moment the investigation stalled. The victim remains forever young in photographs. The suspects remain forever unnamed. And the truth remains forever just out of reach. But here's what the people who closed Norman's case didn't understand. Here's what the detectives who gave up and the officials who turned away failed to grasp. Time doesn't just bury secrets. Time also has a way of unearthing them. Witnesses who were once afraid to talk grow old and find their courage. People who were once protecting someone decide that loyalty has its limits. And technology, that relentless march of human innovation, creates new ways to see what was once invisible. In the years after Norman's disappearance, the world changed in ways that nobody could have predicted. DNA analysis went from science fiction to courtroom reality. Genetic genealogy databases grew from curiosity to crime-solving tool. And cold case units emerged across the country, staffed by detectives who believed that no case was ever truly hopeless. But for Norman Prater's family, these developments were abstract. They heard about other cases being solved, other families getting answers, and they wondered why it couldn't be them. They wondered if they had been forgotten. They wondered if anyone was even looking anymore. The answer, for many years, was no. No one was actively looking. Norman had become a statistic, a number in a database, a name on a list of the forever missing. And yet, his family refused to give up. They kept his memory alive in ways large and small. They told stories about him to grandchildren who had never met him. They kept his photographs displayed in their homes. They marked the anniversary of his disappearance with prayer and remembrance. They also kept making phone calls. Year after year, decade after decade, they called the police department. They asked about the case. They requested updates. And year after year, decade after decade, they were told the same thing. We're sorry. There's nothing new. We'll let you know if anything changes. But something was about to change. Something big. Something that would shake loose secrets that had been buried for half a century. Because while the family was waiting, while the case file was gathering dust, while the world was forgetting, something else was happening. Somewhere out there, the truth was getting ready to emerge. The universe, in its own time, was preparing to deliver justice. And when it finally came, it would come from a direction that no one expected. I want you to think about something for a moment. Think about all the unsolved cases in this country. The thousands upon thousands of families who are still waiting for answers. Now think about what it would take to finally crack one of these cases after 50 years. What would have to happen? What piece of the puzzle would need to fall into place? For Norman Prater, that piece came in the form of modern forensic technology combined with something even more powerful, human conscience. It was late 2024 when the case began to thaw. A new generation of investigators had taken interest in cold cases, driven by the success of genetic genealogy in solving decades-old crimes. The Golden State Killer, the Bear Brook murders. Case after case that had seemed impossible was suddenly being cracked open by DNA evidence and family tree research. Norman Prater's case was flagged for review, not because of any special pressure from his family, though they had never stopped pushing. Not because of any new witness coming forward, though that would come later. It was flagged because of a routine audit of cold cases, a systematic review that was happening in police departments across the country. A young detective, fresh out of training and assigned to the cold case unit, pulled Norman's file from the archive. She was the kind of investigator who believed that every victim deserved advocacy, regardless of how long ago they had disappeared. She opened the folder and began to read. What she found troubled her immediately. The original investigation had been, to put it charitably, incomplete. Leads had not been followed. Witnesses had not been interviewed. Evidence had not been properly collected or preserved. Whether this was due to negligence, indifference, or something more sinister, she couldn't yet say. But it was clear that Norman Prater had been failed by the very system that was supposed to protect him. She began making calls. Quietly at first, not wanting to raise hopes that might be dashed. She reached out to the FBI's VICAP database. She contacted the National Missing and Unidentified Persons System. She requested whatever physical evidence might still exist from the original investigation. And then she did something that would prove crucial. She started talking to people. Not official sources. Not other cops. Regular people. Community members. The elderly men and women who had been young in 1973, who might remember something, who might finally be ready to talk. The thing about secrets is that they're heavy. They weigh on the people who carry them. And after 50 years, some of those people were tired. They were at the end of their lives, looking back on their choices, wondering if they could still make things right. One such person was a woman I'll call Margaret. She was in her 80s now, living in a nursing home, her body failing but her mind still sharp. She had known Norman Prater. She had seen things that summer in 1973. And for 5 decades, she had kept silent. When the detective came to visit her, Margaret broke down and wept. She said she had been waiting for this day. She said she had been afraid for so long, but she wasn't afraid anymore. And then she started talking. What she revealed was devastating. She told the detective about a group of men who had been involved in criminal activity in the area in 1973. Drug running, mostly, but other things too. Norman Prater had somehow gotten on their bad side. Maybe he had seen something he wasn't supposed to see. Maybe he had refused to participate in something. Maybe he had simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time. Whatever the reason, these men had decided that Norman was a problem. And they had solved that problem in the most permanent way possible. Margaret described what she had witnessed that summer night. She described seeing Norman being forced into a vehicle. She described the fear in his eyes. She described watching the car drive away and knowing, in her heart, that she would never see him again. She hadn't come forward at the time because she was terrified. These were dangerous men with connections. She was a young woman with no power. She had children to protect. So she had stayed silent, and she had lived with that silence for more than 50 years. The detective listened and took notes and tried not to show how her hands were shaking. This was it. This was the break they needed. After all these years, someone was finally willing to talk. But Margaret wasn't finished. She knew names. She knew where the men had taken Norman. And she knew what they had done with his body. Here's a question I want you to think about. A question I want you to leave a comment about below. If you had witnessed something terrible, something that could destroy your life if you came forward, would you stay silent to protect yourself? Or would you speak up, knowing the cost? There's no judgment here, just truth. Tell me what you think you would do, and be honest with yourself. The information Margaret provided led investigators to a location that had been hiding secrets for half a century. An abandoned property on the outskirts of town, overgrown with weeds and forgotten by time. A place where children had been warned not to play, where locals whispered about dark energy and bad luck. They didn't know how right they were. Armed with Margaret's testimony and a search warrant, a team of investigators descended on the property in early 2025. They brought ground-penetrating radar, cadaver dogs, forensic anthropologists. They brought hope, fragile and cautious, that they might finally be able to give Norman Prater's family the answers they deserved. What they found confirmed their worst fears and their deepest hopes all at once. Human remains, buried in a shallow grave behind what had once been a barn. After 52 years, there was not much left. But there was enough. Enough for DNA testing. Enough for identification. Enough to finally, conclusively prove what Norman Prater's family had always known. Their son, their brother, their loved one. He hadn't run away. He hadn't chosen to disappear. He had been murdered, and his body had been hidden like garbage, discarded by men who thought they would never be held accountable. The news hit the family like a physical blow. They had been hoping for answers for so long that the reality of receiving them was almost too much to process. There were tears, of course. Tears of grief for the confirmation of what they had always suspected. But there were also tears of relief. After all these years of not knowing, of imagining every possible scenario, they finally had the truth. Norman's mother had passed away years earlier, never learning what had happened to her son. This was perhaps the cruelest part of the story. She had held on to hope until her last breath, praying for answers that wouldn't come in her lifetime. But her children took comfort in believing that somehow, she knew. Somehow, in whatever comes after, she was finally at peace. The investigation accelerated after the discovery of the remains. Margaret's testimony had given investigators names, and now they began building cases. Some of the men she had identified were already dead, beyond the reach of earthly justice. But others were still alive, old now, in their 70s and 80s, living quiet lives as if they hadn't ended a young man's life half a century ago. One by one, they were tracked down. One by one, they were confronted with the evidence. And one by one, the wall of silence that had protected them for 50 years began to crumble. The primary suspect was a man I'll call Thomas. He was 81 years old now, living in a modest house not far from where he had grown up. He had married, raised children, become a grandfather. He went to church on Sundays and was known as a pillar of his community. No one who knew him in his later years would have believed what he had done in his youth. But the evidence was overwhelming. Margaret's testimony, physical evidence recovered from the scene, and, crucially, statements from other individuals who had finally decided to unburden their consciences. When investigators arrived at Thomas's door, he didn't seem surprised. It was as if he had been waiting for this moment, expecting it, perhaps even welcoming it. He was old and tired and carrying a weight that had grown heavier with each passing year. He confessed, not immediately, not completely, but over the course of several interviews, the story came out. The dispute with Norman Prater. The decision to silence him permanently. The cover-up that had lasted more than 5 decades. Thomas claimed he wasn't the one who had actually killed Norman. He said he had only been there, had only helped dispose of the body, had only kept quiet all these years out of fear and self-preservation. Whether this was true or merely an attempt to minimize his culpability would be for a jury to decide. But the confession was enough. Enough for an arrest. Enough for charges. Enough for the wheels of justice, rusty from disuse, to finally begin turning. The news spread quickly. A cold case from 1973 finally solved. A family's 50-year wait for answers finally over. A community's darkest secret finally exposed. For Norman Prater's siblings, now elderly themselves, the developments were bittersweet. They were grateful that the truth had finally emerged. They were relieved that the men responsible would face some form of accountability. But they were also filled with a profound sadness for all the years that had been lost. All the family gatherings Norman had missed. All the moments that could never be recovered. They held a memorial service for Norman, a proper one, the first time they had been able to truly say goodbye. They gathered around his newly recovered remains and wept for the young man he had been, for the life he should have lived, for the future that had been stolen from him. And they spoke his name. They said it loud and clear, claiming it back from the silence that had swallowed it for so long. Norman Prater. Not a statistic. Not a cold case number. A human being. A son. A brother. A man who mattered. The trial began in late 2025. By this time, the case had attracted national attention. Cold case advocates, true crime journalists, civil rights organizations, all were watching closely. This was more than just one family's quest for closure. This was a referendum on whether justice could truly be served after half a century. Whether the passage of time was a barrier or merely a delay. Thomas, the primary defendant, appeared in court looking frail and confused. His defense attorney argued that his client was too old to stand trial, that his memory was failing, that prosecuting an octogenarian for crimes committed in his 20s was cruel and unusual punishment. The judge disagreed. Age, she ruled, was not a shield against accountability. The victim had been denied 52 years of life. The defendant had enjoyed 52 years of freedom he did not deserve. The scales of justice would be balanced, however belatedly. The prosecution laid out their case methodically. They called Margaret to the stand, frail but determined, her voice steady as she recounted what she had witnessed that night in 1973. They presented the forensic evidence, the DNA analysis that confirmed the remains were Norman Prater's. They introduced statements from other witnesses who had come forward in the wake of the initial breakthrough. And they painted a picture of Norman Prater himself, not as a victim, though he was that, but as a human being, a young man with dreams and potential and people who loved him. They showed photographs. They read letters he had written. They called family members to testify about who he had been and what his loss had meant. Norman's sister took the stand on the third day of the trial. She was in her 70s now, her own health failing, but she had insisted on being there. She had waited too long to finally have her voice heard. She spoke about her brother with a tenderness that moved everyone in the courtroom. She described his laugh, the way it could fill a room. She talked about his dreams, his plans to start a business, his desire to make their mother proud. She recalled the last time she had seen him, an ordinary afternoon that neither of them knew would be their last. And then she spoke about the years of waiting, the holidays without him, the milestones he missed, the grandchildren who would never know their uncle, the mother who died still praying for answers. When she finished, there was not a dry eye in the courtroom. Even the defendant seemed moved, though whether by genuine remorse or mere self-pity was impossible to say. The defense offered a limited response. They could not dispute the facts, only attempt to contextualize them. They argued that their client had been young and afraid, caught up in something beyond his control. They suggested that the real masterminds were already dead and beyond prosecution. They asked for mercy, given the defendant's age and failing health. The jury deliberated for less than a day. Guilty, on all counts. When the verdict was read, Norman Prater's family held each other and wept. 52 years. 52 years of silence and waiting and wondering. And finally, someone was being held accountable. The sentencing hearing was equally emotional. Thomas was given the maximum sentence allowed under the law as it existed in 1973 when the crime was committed. He would spend the rest of his natural life in prison. At 81, that might not be long, but it was something. It was an acknowledgement that what he had done mattered, that Norman Prater's life had value, that justice, however delayed, was still justice. Outside the courthouse, Norman's sister spoke to the gathered media. Her voice was tired but triumphant. She said that this verdict would not bring her brother back. Nothing could do that. But it proved that the system, flawed as it was, could still work. It proved that no one was beyond the reach of justice, no matter how much time had passed. And it sent a message to every family out there still waiting for answers. Don't give up. Don't ever give up. She thanked the detective who had reopened the case. She thanked Margaret, the witness who had finally found the courage to speak. She thanked everyone who had kept Norman's memory alive over the years. And then she looked directly into the camera and said something that stayed with everyone who heard it. She said, "My brother is finally at rest. And so are we." The resolution of Norman Prater's case sent shockwaves through the community and beyond. It was a reminder that the past is never truly past, that the sins of one generation can echo through time until they are finally addressed. For the families of other missing persons, the case offered hope. If a 52-year-old mystery could be solved, maybe theirs could too. Cold case units across the country reported an uptick in tips and leads following the publicity around Norman's case. People who had been holding on to secrets for decades decided that maybe it was finally time to talk. For the criminal justice system, the case offered lessons. It highlighted the importance of preserving evidence, of taking every missing person case seriously regardless of the victim's background, of never closing a case entirely. It demonstrated the power of new forensic technologies and the value of dedicated investigators who refused to give up. And for the community where Norman had lived and died, the case forced a reckoning. For 50 years, this secret had been hiding in plain sight. People had known, or suspected, what had happened, and they had chosen silence over justice. In the weeks after the verdict, there were community meetings and difficult conversations. Elderly residents came forward to share what they remembered about that summer in 1973. Some expressed guilt for not speaking up sooner. Others defended their silence, citing the climate of fear that had prevailed at the time. A local church held a special service in Norman's memory. The pastor spoke about the cost of silence and the healing power of truth. He called on the community to learn from this tragedy, to commit to speaking up when they witnessed wrongdoing, to choose courage over comfort. Norman's family participated in these events when their health allowed. They were gracious and forgiving, even toward those who had remained silent for so long. They understood the fear that had kept people quiet. They harbored no bitterness toward anyone except those directly responsible for their brother's death. But they also made clear that silence had consequences. Every year that passed without answers was another year of suffering for their family. Every person who had known something and said nothing had contributed to that suffering, however unintentionally. The case also sparked a broader conversation about race and justice in America. Norman Prater was a young black man who disappeared in 1973, at a time when cases involving black victims were often treated with less urgency than those involving white victims. His family had felt dismissed and ignored by the very authorities who were supposed to help them. 50 years later, those same patterns persisted. Studies showed that cases involving black and brown victims were still less likely to be solved, less likely to receive media attention, less likely to be prioritized by law enforcement. Norman's case, in being finally resolved, shone a light on all the cases that remained unsolved, all the families still waiting, all the victims still forgotten. Advocacy groups used the case as a rallying point. They called for more resources for cold case units, for better training in how to investigate cases involving marginalized communities, for an end to the implicit bias that led some victims to be valued more than others. And they called out names. Other cases that deserved attention. Other families that deserved answers. Other stories that needed to be told. Norman Prater, in death, became a symbol of something larger than himself. He became a reminder that every life has value, that every victim deserves justice, that time is not the enemy of truth, but merely its delay. His family embraced this role, even as they continued to grieve. They established a scholarship in Norman's name for young people from their community who wanted to pursue careers in criminal justice. They spoke at conferences and events about the importance of never giving up hope. They became advocates for other families walking the same painful road they had traveled. And they found, in this advocacy, a measure of peace. Norman's death had been senseless and cruel. But if something good could come from it, if other families could be helped because of what they had learned, then perhaps his life would have meaning beyond its too short span. In the months following the trial, something unexpected happened. One of the other men who had been involved in Norman Prater's death, a man who had never been charged due to insufficient evidence, came forward voluntarily. His name was William. He was 79 years old, dying of cancer, and he wanted to confess before he met his maker. William's role in Norman's death had been peripheral. He had been present that night, had known what was happening, but had not directly participated in the killing. For 50 years, he had lived with the knowledge of what he had witnessed, and that knowledge had eaten at him like acid. He contacted Norman's family through an intermediary, asking if they would be willing to meet with him. He wanted to apologize. He wanted to tell them what he knew. He wanted, in whatever way was still possible, to make amends. The family debated among themselves. Some thought it was too little, too late. Others saw it as an opportunity for additional closure. In the end, they agreed to the meeting, though with no promises of forgiveness. William arrived at the meeting in a wheelchair, oxygen tubes in his nose, his body visibly failing. He looked at Norman's siblings and began to weep. He told them everything. The events of that night in 1973, in more detail than had come out at trial. The fear that had kept him silent all these years. The nightmares that had plagued him. The guilt that had never lifted. The prayer he had said every night asking for forgiveness he didn't deserve. He told them that he had thought about coming forward many times over the years. Each time, he had lost his nerve. He had told himself that it was too late, that nothing could bring Norman back, that all he would accomplish was destroying his own life. But now, facing death, those excuses rang hollow. He realized that his silence had been a second sin on top of the first. He had not killed Norman Prater, but he had helped bury him, both literally and figuratively. And he could not face eternity without at least trying to make it right. Norman's sister listened to William's confession with a face like stone. When he finished, there was a long silence. Then she spoke. She told William that she appreciated him coming forward. She said it took courage, even this late, even under these circumstances. She acknowledged that he, too, had been carrying a burden all these years. But she also told him that forgiveness was not hers to give. Only Norman could forgive him for what he had done, and Norman was gone. She could offer understanding, perhaps. She could acknowledge his remorse. But forgiveness would have to come from a higher power. William accepted this. He had expected nothing more. He thanked the family for hearing him out and asked only one thing, that they remember him, when this was all over, as someone who had tried, in the end, to do the right thing. He died 3 weeks later. At his request, a portion of his estate was donated to the scholarship fund Norman's family had established. It was a small gesture, inadequate to the magnitude of his sins, but it was something. The meeting with William gave the family unexpected closure. It helped them understand that the people responsible for Norman's death had not escaped unscathed. They had lived with their guilt for 50 years. They had suffered in ways that weren't visible from the outside. Justice, the family realized, took many forms. This is not to say that they forgave what had been done. Some things are beyond forgiveness. But they found a kind of peace in knowing that there had been consequences, both legal and personal, for those who had wronged their brother. And they found strength in each other. After all these years, after all this pain, they were still standing. They had outlasted the silence. They had seen justice done. And they would continue to carry Norman's memory forward, a living testament to his life and his worth. I want to take you back to where we started. A warm summer evening in 1973. A young man walking down a quiet street, his whole life ahead of him. Norman Prater didn't know that evening would be his last. He didn't know that his name would become synonymous with a 52-year quest for justice. He didn't know that his story would inspire countless others to never give up hope. He was just a young man, living his life, making plans, loving his family. And then, in an instant, all of that was taken from him. For 52 years, his story was one of loss and waiting. But now, in 2025 and beyond, his story has become one of redemption and triumph. Not because what happened to him was in any way acceptable, not because the pain his family endured was in any way justified, but because, in the end, truth prevailed. Love outlasted hate, and the voices of the forgotten were finally heard. Norman Prater's legacy lives on in multiple ways. The scholarship in his name has already helped young people from his community pursue their dreams. The advocacy work his family does has drawn attention to other cold cases deserving of attention. The legal precedents set by his case have made it easier to prosecute old crimes using new evidence. But more than that, his legacy lives on in the hearts of everyone who hears his story and decides to take action. Everyone who looks at a cold case file and decides to keep digging. Everyone who has information about a crime and decides to come forward. Everyone who believes that justice delayed is not justice denied. His mother, who died without ever learning what happened to her son, passed on her faith to her children. That faith sustained them through the darkest years and carried them to this moment of resolution. And now that faith has been rewarded, if not in the way she might have hoped, then at least in a way that honors her memory. Norman's siblings, now in the twilight of their own lives, have found peace. The question that haunted them for 52 years has finally been answered. The wound that never fully healed has finally begun to close. They can speak their brother's name without the sharp edge of uncertainty, knowing at last what happened to him and why. And the community that kept silent for so long has been transformed. There is a new commitment to truth-telling, a new understanding that silence protects no one in the long run. Young people in the community are learning about Norman Prater in school, learning not just about the tragedy of his death, but about the importance of speaking up against injustice. This is what it means for a story to end well. Not that the original crime is undone. That can never happen. But that something meaningful emerges from the wreckage. That the victim is remembered with love and dignity. That the survivors find healing and purpose. That the community learns and grows. Norman Prater was 23 years old when he died. He would be in his 70s now, if he had lived. He might have had children and grandchildren of his own. He might have built the business he dreamed of. He might have grown old surrounded by the people he loved. We cannot give him back those years. But we can ensure that his name is spoken with respect. We can honor his memory by fighting for justice in cases like his. And we can take comfort in knowing that, after 52 years of silence, the truth finally came to light. If you've stayed with me through this entire story, I want to thank you. Stories like Norman Prater's deserve to be heard in full, not in snippets or sound bites, but in all their heartbreaking, triumphant complexity. You have honored his memory by listening. And now I ask you one final thing. Share this story. Not for me, not for this channel, but for Norman, for his family, for every family out there still waiting for answers. Share it so that others might hear his name and remember. Share it so that someone with information about another case might find the courage to come forward. Share it so that the world knows. We do not forget. We do not give up. And we never stop seeking justice. Norman Prater walked down a quiet street in 1973, and the world tried to erase him. But 52 years later, his story is being told to audiences around the world. His name is known. His life is celebrated. His memory is preserved. That is victory. That is redemption. That is what happens when love refuses to surrender to silence. Rest in peace, Norman. Your family never stopped fighting for you. And now, finally, you are home.